very excited to be here today to be moderating this distinguished panel. So I want to say one thing. As Barb pointed out, one of the reasons why we chose this topic this year is because we are really, Think Small is really moving and working towards population results of all children being ready for kindergarten. And within that, we are very well aware that we are facing challenges when it comes to our opportunity gaps and our achievement gaps that start very young. And so one of the things that we know that is affecting our outcomes is the implicit bias that not only happens in our early childhood programs, but throughout our culture and our society here in Minnesota. Being raised as an African-American child here in Minnesota, I'm born and raised, this is something that not only have I experienced personally growing up, but now experiencing as I'm raising my children here in this environment. So it's something that I know a lot about, have a lot of firsthand experience with. So at this time, I'm very pleased to invite to the stage our panelists, and we've kind of laid out a little structure here. I'm inviting Barty Wahi, who is the Executive Director of Children's Defense Fund. She's going to kind of talk and give us a little bit of information about implicit bias. Along with that, you all can come, yeah. Charisse Pickren she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. And also Gertrude Matassa from Phyllis Wheatley Community Center, Executive Director of Phyllis Wheatley Community Center. So one thing I want to point out about this year's session is a little different, that today is the beginning, what we would like to consider the beginning of a conversation. So we have 4 parts to this series. Today is the first one. And towards the end, we would like to hold a little bit of time to have some conversation with you that's going to help us to develop more the topics for the next one, because we really want to be able to get to the bottom of some of this. But today is kind of our kickoff. So starting us off, Barty, I want to tell you a little bit about our panelists. Barty Wahi, the Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund. She has 20 years of experience as an advocate in the nonprofit field and has more than a decade of experience in education. Prior to joining Children's Defense Fund, she spent 3 years with the Greater Twin Cities United Way as a funder and oversaw several grant portfolios related to early childhood, two-generation, intergenerational programming. Barty's going to talk today a little bit about giving us a definition of implicit bias. What does it mean? And then after her, Charisse, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Child Development at University of Minnesota. She earned her PhD in 2018 and also an MS in developmental psychology from the University of Massachusetts. She does research examining the underlying mechanisms that support social development in the first 3 years of life and how early experiences fine-tune both brain and behavioral development in the context of processing social information about gender and race. And so she's going to talk to us a little bit about her research and how it relates to this topic. And last but certainly not least, Gertrude, who is the Executive Director of Phyllis Wheatley, has nearly 20 years of program development experience, is also a former small business owner as an early learning center. And she has also a former Women's Business Center director. And she is going to talk to us about how this relates in practice, how actually providing programming that is culturally responsive, how that impacts early childhood development. So we have a lot to do today, so I'm going to get us started off. And I'm going to let each one do a little bit of intro and talk a little bit, and then we'll get back to some questions. So go ahead, Barty.
I got it. Good morning, everybody. All right. I know it's early, so that was pretty good for this early in the morning. So I have the the task of providing some definitions around implicit bias, and I get to do that in 5 minutes. So here we go, folks, right? But what I do want to highlight, I think that Diane has said, I think as an immigrant woman and as somebody who came to this country without speaking English, the sort of bias around sort of what my abilities were going to be or not going to be stuck with me. I was sort of very early on tracked in special education, mostly only because I didn't speak English. And that stuck with me until I went to college. I got there and they said, we don't think you have a diagnosis. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't think I did either, right? But that stuck with me for a really long time. And not only it was about how other people saw me, but it was also about how I saw myself. So when we think about the implications of how implicit bias sort of plays out for kids, those are some of the ways, right? And I want to hold that in the center of this conversation because there are real world implications for when bias is sort of operating in ways that impact kids. So, okay, very quickly, I think one good definition of implicit bias that I've found is that implicit bias are the assumptions, attitudes, stereotypes that affect our understanding and actions and the decisions in an unconscious manner. So we are not aware that they're happening, which makes it really challenging because how do you address something that you're not aware of, right? And these biases can be both favorable and unfavorable assessments. And they're activated involuntarily, right? They're just sort of in the mix, in our way of being and knowing the world, right? And this matters because it causes us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on a variety of characteristics, including race, ethnicity, age, ability, sexual orientation, accent, and appearance, right? And so, again, I want to highlight that these are biases that we are not even aware that we are having, right? But that are coloring our actions and our activities every single day. And these develop over the course of time. Therese has some amazing information, so I just can't wait for her to start talking. But about how these start very early, right? And they carry with us, and it grows over time. And these are the sort of unconscious messages that we hear from home, we see in the media, and this influences how we start to understand our world, right? And it is important to understand implicit bias because it is pervasive because it is not fully present, right? We don't see it. That implicit and explicit bias, right? So more overt demonstrations of bias are related, but they are distinct, right? They are intersecting, but they are also distinct because oftentimes our implicit bias may be at odds at what our stated position on things is, right? Again, it is about the unconscious ways that we know and understand the world. And oftentimes we favor our own group, however we define that, right? And what I want to sort of highlight is that this happens to everybody. None of us, right, are above having implicit bias that informs the way in which we understand our world, right? So I want to sort of offer that up there, that there's not a single one of us. I certainly have them, oftentimes operating all the time in lots of ways I'm not even aware of. And I think that one thing that I think is helpful to understand is that I think implicit bias is malleable, right? That through exposure to different people and different understandings and different worlds, we can start to begin to shape how we understand. And I think the thing that's really important is that once we begin to gain greater awareness of sort of the things that and ways, the values, the assumptions that we're operating, then we can make a choice about how we're behaving and operating, right? And so I think that that's really critical. I think in our next slide, ding. Do you guys remember those books? Turn the page. So these are the characteristics. So I'm going to highlight one more, Tammy. Ding. Here we go, right? So why we are talking about implicit bias today and why it is important is because it is oftentimes implicit bias that informs the mental models by which we understand the world, right? So in our world, there are certain assumptions, understandings that then influence the structures and the systems that we work in, the patterns of behaviors that we have, and eventually the events that we are trying to address in our work. And if we are not aware, at least at a minimum, that we have implicit bias, right? We may not always be aware of what those are, but that we have them. and that those may be influencing the very structures, the foundation of the work that we are doing every day. Whether you are working with children, whether you are working in state government, whether you are working in philanthropy, whether you are working as an advocate, you will continue oftentimes to exacerbate those biases, right? And so I think it's very important for us to think about this. Last time I did this, I did it with a class, and I made them run through this about some of the sort of implicit bias people hold and how they shape the mental models that inform our structures and systems, the patterns of behavior for those people who are in those systems, and finally how we address events. And they did a really great job, because I think if you start to think about it, you can sort of see the way in which this begins to move forward. Ding. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this a little bit later, but what I really want us to do today is to start to think and hold ourselves to a certain level of accountability around this. How many people have been to a conversation about race equity, about implicit bias before? Raise your hands. Right? So I think the challenge here in Minnesota is we've spent a lot of time admiring this issue and the problem without really thinking about how do I hold myself accountable and how do I hold my own work accountable, my organizations accountable, the systems I operate in. And I want you to be thinking about that as you hear these amazing women who have done a lot of research and are doing a lot of work in terms of really holding that in the center.
Thank you, Barbie. That was great. Now we're on to what does the research say?
Great. Good morning, everyone. So let's jump into some research. And on the slide that will be presented, it's just a kind of a really quick snapshot, and I'm going to go into a little bit more about each of these topics. So the first is just this question of when in development, when do we start to see implicit biases start to come online? And so what researchers have found is that between 3 and 5 years of age, so right around that preschool age range, we are starting to find that children are showing some implicit bias. And what does implicit bias look like at that age? It seems to be more about in-group love, right? So they're starting to establish an awareness of their group membership at this age, and it's more about loving your people, like your in-groups, right? And it's not so much about what could be kind of framed as out-group hate is not quite where we're at this age. It's more about preferring and having a really fast and biased positive view of your in-group members. And your group can be defined in lots of different ways, one of them being kind of a race group membership. Now, in some of the research that I'm currently working on, kind of hot off the press right here, is that even before we get to 3 to 5 years, so before we even are entering into kind of a formal school setting, we are noticing that infants between 1 and 2 years of age are starting to use markers of race and gender as ways to kind of detect and keep track of people in their environment, right? So this is not to say that they are showing implicit bias, is what we've just defined, but that even at 24 months, kids are noticing that the features of a face that represent maybe a gender or represent some sort of race group are important markers to keep track of people as they're interacting with one another. And even earlier than 2 years of age, we have work that shows that the people that infants are spending time with between 6 and 9 and 12 months of age, your brain is really firing into those people. The languages that you hear, the gender and the race of the faces that you see are really shaping the way that we're going to be long-term being able to differentiate and process information expressed from a face, whether that's identifying a stranger from someone who's familiar, processing intent and emotional information from a face, as well as the attention that we are expressing. And so what research is also showing is that infants around 9 to 12 months of age are starting to have they can create associations between a race group member a face of a race who's not familiar to them, and they tend to seem to associate this with like sad or negative music, and they also have some associations with an unfamiliar race group with an unfamiliar language that is spoken. So again, this is not to say that these are clear evidence of implicit bias, but I wanted to kind of lay out that at 3 to 5 is not just all of a sudden your 3-year-old wakes up and starts having implicit bias, right? So there's this long trajectory that none of it is purposeful. None of it is parents teaching children to have this bias. It's really driven by the early experiences that infants are having, who they see, who they're learning to pay attention to. So hopefully that's not kind of a downing, but it's more of this is a time period that's really important because this is a time period that our brains are just kind of exploding with the ability to learn, right? And so we want to really highlight how important 0 to 3 is, and keeping with Think Small, being ready for kindergarten, social and emotional information processing is really important as well. And I'll get a little bit more into this, but kind of where those implicit biases come from, there are lots of different pathways that researchers are starting to understand and build some frameworks and understanding how do we end up with this in-group love kind of idea. And it's, part of it is to be successful in your in-group, right? It's not necessarily always kind of a bad thing, but it's just then how is it changing the way we then interact with others who are not necessarily in our in-group. And so really briefly, we know that starting from birth, essentially, we're really good at picking up patterns. And I'm going to go more into detail about this, but overall, one of the kind of concepts that we are thinking that implicit biases are developing from is just purely learning and drawing conclusions about the way the observations we are making about how people are interacting with one another seems to be a really critical piece to developing these implicit biases. And then kind of lastly, where do we go from there, right? So what do we do with this information that both of you will probably also speak to? And so as I mentioned, this time period between 0 and 3 is really critical for brain development. And you don't want to take brain development away from your social context. So your brain is being shaped by your environment in lots of different ways: physical, emotional, your attachment to your caregivers. So these are time periods where we want to try to foster and encourage meaningful connections with lots of different people. So trying to think about who's in your space and who do you see on a frequent basis, and then making sure you make points to learn individual names. So some of the research that's just coming out right now, and this is pretty interesting, I think, is that in 3 to 5-year-olds, when they start to learn the individual name, so learning that this face is Sally and this face is Carlos, when they learn to match individual names with a person, with a picture of a person, their implicit bias and their associations with kind of negative associations with racially unfamiliar faces decreases, and this is something that is sustained. So that's just one. It's a very specific example, and it's not something that you can kind of walk around the grocery store and point everybody's name out, but it's this idea that connecting and learning to know about somebody else on an individual basis is a really valued process that kids are using to gear into reducing that implicit bias. I guess I'll end there.
Thank you, Cherise. That's fascinating. I just wanted to pause here and recognize that our Lieutenant Governor has joined us, Peggy Flanagan, so thank you for being here. Next, we'll go on to our last panelist who's going to talk to us about the importance of culturally based early childhood. Gertrude.
Thank you, Diane. And good morning. And I'm really excited today to talk about the work that I do every day at Phyllis Wheatley Community Center. Our child care center is the longest running continuously running childcare center in the state. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, Cisa. In the state of Minnesota, we were established in 1929 and still running strong. But I wanted to give a little bit of a background on sort of my view on culturally specific care. Starting when I was a little girl in Zimbabwe, growing up in a predominantly Black neighborhood, attending predominantly Black schools. And as a little girl, there were a few white kids in my class, but the Black kids were always the ones who were top of the class. I cannot remember a time when there was ever a white kid who was considered one of the smart kids. And so growing up, I didn't think white people were smart at all. I would look at them and I'd say, oh, they're just different people, God loves them, but they're not smart. But we all know that that is not true. And so fast forward to my kids here in the United States, they are Black kids, and they would say the opposite of that, which is really, really sad. But the reason why that was so is because I came to understand, as I've been in the education arena and education in general, is that education system was created for Black African kids. And so they could be successful in that system because it was created specifically for them. And so here in Minnesota, if you are a parent who has Black kids or children of color, you're faced with two options that are really not ideal. The first one is you ask your friends, what is the best place for me to take my 3-year-old? And they'll say, oh, this place is really amazing, it's rated 10 out of 10. But there isn't that, they skip the extra piece. For whom is it rated a 10 out of 10? Your kid may end up being the only kid in the class who has, who is brown or Black. The other option is a place where everybody looks like your child, but it's not very good. Maybe it's not 4-star rated, maybe it's not even rated or licensed. At Phyllis Wheatley, our belief is that parents shouldn't have to choose between just those two. And what we try to do is to really provide care that's high quality. So Parent Aware 4-star rated, yay, Parent Aware, NACE accredited, and also affordable. And most importantly, culturally specific to African American families. Our belief is that when we hear about achievement gaps, that is not because of ability. We don't believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with all the Black kids in Minnesota who are being left behind. We believe that there's something more, something deeper, and we can have a longer conversation at another time about that. But what it looks like for us is that 95% of our kids in our childcare center are African American. And about the same percentage of our teachers are African American. And we specifically hire teachers from the community. And why is that? Because we want our kids to see themselves reflected in their teachers. We want our teachers, when they look at the kids, to not make assumptions about the kids, about their abilities. And so when our teachers look at our kids, they see their own children, they see their nieces and nephews, they see themselves in our children. And so ultimately, our kids feel loved, they feel understood, and most importantly, that transition from home to school is seamless because they're hearing the same language, the same way of speaking at home and at school, because we do both. We do both formal English and, whatever our kids are accustomed to at home as well. When we look at our curriculum and the way we've structured it, we didn't create this curriculum just with African American kids in mind. We created it for them. And so it is customized to reflect the culture and the language of African American families. When you come into our classrooms, the artwork on the walls, the books we read, we all celebrate the beauty and the culture of the African American community. And so our kids on a daily basis are feeling validated. They're okay. They feel okay. They're okay with their hair. They're okay with their skin. They're okay with themselves. They're okay with their environment. And so what we're seeing is that our kids are excited to learn. And when we present materials to them, because those materials are created specifically for them, they're grasping it, they're understanding. We read a comprehension passage, they're understanding it because they can relate to it. And so all of this, we do all of this because we want our children to be ready for kindergarten. We want them to be really prepared for the world. And we have a history of ranging between 95 and 100% of our kids testing kindergarten ready every year. This is why we do what we do. This is why we believe that as part of the solution, when we look at African American kids and children of color in general, that culturally specific care works. We have seen it since 1929. It's working for us, and we believe this could be part of the solution to this problem.
Great, thank you. Thank all of us. So at this time, I'm going to ask a couple follow-up questions of our panelists. But if you all may have questions, start getting them ready, because at some point in time, if there are questions from the audience, we'll invite you to ask them. But I'm going to start off with a question to Barty. So you talked about the fact that implicit bias is something that we are not aware of. But once we become aware of the fact that there is implicit bias, what can we do about our own biases?
Not do them. No. I think that given the sheer volume of people who have admitted here that they have been to other kinds of trainings here, it means that at least you have an awareness that you have implicit bias. You may not be aware of the bias themselves, but you know that there are certain underlying values and assumptions that you bring to your work in the world every day. And I think as I was driving here today, there was a little NPR thing, and it was about the Federal Reserve Bank just did this thing about the achievement gap, and I thought, thank you, Federal Reserve Bank, for doing that. I think it's really important to have the data and one more report to tell us this is going on, right? And I think that I talked about accountability because I think if you look on your table, there are some little rulers. It's the accountability pathway. Yo, Peggy, right? Yay, Casey, right? But on there is sort of like how we are thinking about accountability. And I brought this today because I think it's an interesting tool, but I think more importantly, when we think, many of us spend time having these conversations about addressing implicit bias, thinking about racial equity, and then nothing happens, right? And then we continue to operate in the same ways that we have historically. And I bring the accountability pathway because I think we sit in Minnesota and we are sort of aware there's an issue, and then we go back, we slip back over the line, and we're waiting and hoping for someone to give us the answer. Barty, what should we do? Stop it, right? We're waiting for Superman, right? Or Superwoman. But I think that the fact of the matter is like, we need to think about how this is operating in our work every day. Like, you need to bring a kind of intentionality and mindfulness that I think both Sharice and Gertrude are talking about in the context of your work, because this is always at play. And whether you're working with children, whether you are working with families, whether you're working in community, whether you're working in systems, you have to constantly be aware of like what's influencing me, and what could I potentially be bringing to the table that is both helpful and not. But then how am I going to do something different? We've got to do something different. And whether it's how you were thinking about hiring practice, how you were thinking about a curriculum, how you are thinking about the leadership in your organization, in your systems, these are all really critical components to how we are going to resolve this problem. And I think instead of waiting and hoping, right, I'm always sort of concerned with panels like this, although I'm super happy to put you here, is that like we're waiting for, I think, either Black or brown people to tell us how we're going to make this better, right? And we need to just start taking ownership, right? I don't live in a rural area to not be required to take ownership about the disparities that exist in rural spaces, right? If that holds true for me, why are we not waiting? And I see this all the time. So I guess I would just really point to the fact that we need to move to a greater place. If you're looking at the accountability ruler right now, we need to move to the right. and I think that is sort of what I would offer to that question.
Thank you. And also a big thank you to Casey Foundation, who's
The rulers are all from them.
Free, so thank you. So just a follow-up question to you, Cherise. So you talked about how early children are recognizing patterns. Can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of information children are taking from their environment that then leads to the implicit bias?
Sure, yes. So as I mentioned, kind of a survival skill is to be able to recognize patterns in our environment. That is found with learning language, right? Learning who your family caretakers are really important patterns that infants are kind of born with and have these tools to start to learn. And those patterns also come from interactions in verbal and nonverbal language. So this is one of the kind of core pieces that researchers are starting to look at, is to understand how implicit biases are developing, is looking at making observations about how we interact with one another through verbal and nonverbal sources of language. So for example, we can make a type of social category either more salient or less salient based on the type of words that we're using. And so oftentimes you might hear a classroom say, a teacher might say, okay, boys and girls, we're going to do this. Or let's have all of the blank children in this group. Let's have all the blank children in this room. And again, the language is fine, right? And it's not being spoken in a malicious way. But what's happening is that kids are then hearing the words boys and girls, or whatever the case might be, that are then saying, okay, I'm learning that is keying into something that's important that separates people. And so you can also think about that the way we talk about for race, related to different race groups. And this is not to suggest that we go around using a colorblind framework, because lots of research shows us that that's not going to work and it doesn't work, right? But we want to be thinking about, okay, how am I referring to people? How do I group people together? Because our 3-year-olds, our 2-year-olds are noticing that. And so that would just be an example of kind of the verbal cues that we hear that are just commonly ingrained in our language. And also nonverbal cues. So some work that is showing that infants, so we're really good at processing information from faces, especially the faces of our caregivers. And so when we're seeing kind of proximity, so if I am really close to one person here and I'm smiling at Gertrude and I'm engaging in this way that I'm not to Bertie, I'm keeping my distance, maybe my tone is a little bit flatter, these things like this that, again, we're not necessarily always thinking about because this is implicit actions, but our kids are noticing it too. So, it's something that these are just some examples to kind of think about in reflecting on where is this implicit bias coming from. Another piece is children's own awareness of their group membership and their group status. And again, and it's all interconnected, so it's hard to kind of parse it apart and say this is the one thing that's resulting in implicit bias. But as children start to be aware of who their group is through the experience of language or who is present, right, growing up in different types of environments, so who is common, what is the racial or gender demographics, kids start to notice that that those are important markers. And so as you are becoming aware of your own group membership, you also are learning about who is valued and who has particular jobs. And again, 3-year-olds are noticing it too, right? It's not just, oh, they're so young, it's not until adulthood that we notice or make these assumptions. And so what we see is that these categories become salient, and we want to say, what we show is that children who are in racial majority or higher status groups show that implicit positive in-group. My racial in-group, the people that are of the same race group as my environment, I have that positive feeling for them. Interestingly, that varies based on the gender of the child, the gender of the people they're looking at. It also varies then for children who are in racial minority or marginalized groups. So work shows that African American children, Hispanic children they don't show that in-group positivity. They're actually showing an implicit biases towards the racial majority, so white children groups, right? So it's not so much that Black and brown children have in-group negative, they just are neutral. And so instead they're learning, my group is not of a higher status, this other group is. I'm going to more quickly associate happy faces, positive feelings with the higher status group. Okay, and so again, this is coming online really early in our children. And so this idea of what's salient, how we are interacting with one another, and then third being this idea of status and children's own understanding of group membership are three really key pieces that are kind of all connected into the development of these implicit biases. So I think that was a lot to take off, but those are the three ones that as a take-home point.
Thank you. And then I just want to have one follow-up question to Gertrude. So as we think about, you did a really good job of talking about how effective having a culturally based environment for children can be for African American children. But as we think about how our culture, even here in Minnesota, we have one of the fastest growing populations of color in the country. It's just growing really fast. How do we develop our children for a society that's multicultural, multilingual? So what are some things we can do around that?
So while we value culture-specific care that we provide, we also are very intentional about exposing our kids to the real world. We teach a lot about first valuing self, and so you can value and respect others. So within our curriculum, we build in activities. We have partnerships with predominantly white institutions where there are structured events throughout the year where our kids are exposed to this. But ultimately, we believe that during these formative years, building that confidence sort of gives our kids that lift that they need. So they know first and foremost, who am I? Am I okay? Is my skin okay? Is my family okay? Is my dialect okay? Once they have those things and they're okay with themselves, then they can become really positive people in the real world. And we find that our kids excel at all kinds of schools. Some of them go on to predominantly white institutions and they do just fine. Some of them continue to go to more predominantly Black institutions and they're just fine. And so, but we just believe that foundation of building them up as people while they're young is what makes the big difference.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe if anyone has like a burning question they would like to ask our panelists. Please raise your hand. Oh, let's see. We got questions, couple questions.
So, my name is Nancy Johnson, and I would like to ask you about if we see so many directors of development centers not embracing their role as understanding or even where do they get the information about even knowing about implicit bias, and yet our programs and centers, for instance, crazy. And many parents don't have the opportunity, many parents of color, to find a culturally specific program for their child. How do we start getting this message out to directors that you need to be the keeper of this flame? That everything we do with babies and toddlers starts in culture. Everything. So if you have a white staff primarily, or even if your staff is multicultural, you need to be looking at, as a coach, I would see programs where one or two children would be children of color. This is primarily in the suburbs.
Yep.
And the teacher in that room would of course say, oh yes, I want to make sure every one of our kids succeeds. But I would see examples where the kids of color would be ignored or would be just completely misunderstood until their behavior got more and more frustrating, and then they would be disciplined and set off. So even more separated from the group. And when I would talk to the director about that, the director would say, oh no, we treat everyone the same. We love our kids. So do you have suggestions for how we can start having this conversation?
Anyone? It's open.
You know, I think as a parent of children, that where I've had to have conversations with teachers about those generalities, I think it's scary when people say those kinds of things. Like when people say things like, I don't see color, or, you know, which is like so false, or we just love all our kids equally, and yet you can't really understand where that kid is coming from. I think that one of the things that we can do is really challenge our teachers. And I think as parents, it can start with parents. Really talking to, our schools, whoever is, to say, we need to challenge ourselves to have conversations. It always starts out with a conversation. I had an incident where my child, who is a very well-trained performer, was given a role that was clearly the worst role based on the color of her skin. And what I did was I decided to engage the whole group. I said, this is going to be uncomfortable, but we should have this conversation about implicit bias. This was a couple of years ago. And they were so grateful. It was very uncomfortable, but they were so grateful that I came to them in a very respectful way and with an intention to build something. And so I think as long as people are not feeling attacked, as long as you're approaching people with this idea of building something constructive, people will listen. But I think as my co-panelists here mentioned, that none of us are immune or above implicit bias. When we look at someone, we make a lot of assumptions. And so having those continuous conversations is really the beginning, but it's not an easy thing. What do you guys have to say?
I would also say that going back to what Barty was saying about accountability, in Gertrude's example, which I think for many parents of color, there will always come a time where you are faced with a situation like that where you have to be the one to speak out and point out things. But along the accountability pathway, what that does then is it always places the burden on the parent of color, or a family of color, or a child of color to come forward. And so in your example, Nancy, everyone's accountable. So if you are seeing something or somebody else is coming in and seeing something, it's up to you and everyone else to speak up to whatever it is that you are witnessing in that moment. Because that's the only way that some of this, it's going to get turned around when we all take, accountability.
I would also say we have systems of understanding quality in Minnesota, and although I think there have been great strides, I think that we have to expand our understanding of the definition of quality, because those kids are not having the same experience,
No, they're not.
right? And so I would say that whether we're talking about parent aware or accreditation, that there has to be greater emphasis in sort of how all kids are in that space, right? I feel like I hear this a lot. Well, we see all kids the same, or and also like I don't really actually have a lot of kids of color, so how is this salient or relevant to me? And I think Sharice's information here today speaks to how that is important. Whether you are sitting here in St. Paul or you are sitting in Morristown, Minnesota, right? Like the fact of the matter is that's real. And so thinking about how our systems of quality are also really encouraging people to think more, I think more specifically about this. And here's what I also just want to add. I think Gertrude certainly makes a strong case for culturally relevant programming because she's rocking it out, right? I would also say that our systems of early childhood and our K-12 education are also culturally specific programs designed for white middle-class children, right? So we actually have a lot of evidence to speak to how cultural specificity is amazing for kids because that's our system in Minnesota, right? So I would, and implicit bias is all up in there in terms of some of the assumptions, right? So I think thinking more specifically, I operate at a systems level, how our systems are holding individual people who are engaged with kids to think about their own bias and how that's playing out in the classroom. And I think all of us have a role in that.
Excellent. So I know we could talk about this for a long time, but our time is not going to allow us to do that. First of all, I before we move on, I just want to give a hand to all of our panelists who've done a fantastic job.